Good morning. I now call the meeting of Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment to order. My name is Jackie Jacobson. I'm the MLA for Nunukput and the Committee Chair of Economic Development and Environment. Our first order of business is open the meeting in prayer. I'll ask MLA Bonatrush if he could say a morning prayer.
Let's see, Creator, we ask your blessing and guidance for good health and good thoughts for all the people of the Northwest Territories. We look to your guidance to lead us down the right path as we make decisions for the people. We ask nothing more than the simplest things that life has to offer. Merci.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bonatrush. Thank you, Mr. Clerk. Are there any additions and changes to the agenda?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have a public meeting with the Minister of Infrastructure on Marine Transport Service, and then we'll go in camera for a wrap-up discussion, mining fiscal review, and internet connectivity.
Mr. Clerk, hearing no changes to the agenda, can I have a motion to approve the agenda as presented? Mr. Johnson, thank you. MLA Johnson has moved the adoption of the agenda. The motion's in order. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion's carried. Having reviewed the adoption of the agenda, are there any declarations of conflict of interest? Hearing none. Today's meeting is live streamed on the Assembly social media channels, and presentation materials will be available on the Legislative Assembly website after this meeting is concluded. To respect physical and distancing requirements, witnesses or be attending video conference. I'd like to remind all members and witnesses comments, questions, and remarks are directed to myself as the chair of the committee. Both members and witnesses wait to be recognized by the chair before speaking. I'll now ask the members to introduce themselves for the record, starting with MLA Mr. Bonatrush.
Ron Bonatrush, Techo.
Alan Johnson, MLA for Yellowknife North.
Kevin O'Reilly, Frame Lake.
And myself, Jackie Jacobson, MLA for Nunukput Committee Chair. Thank you, members. I'll ask the Minister Archie to introduce herself and their staff and to proceed with opening remarks. Good morning, Madam Minister. Proceed.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, and Queen Aini Masicho for giving us the opportunity to present today. So with me today, I have my Deputy Minister, Steve Ludent. I also have with me John Vandenberg, who's the ADM for Programs and Services. Mr. Chair, would you like me to start with my opening remarks?
Yes, Madam Minister, you could proceed with your opening remarks. Thank you.
Okay, so again, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, committee, for inviting us here today. We're here to brief the committee on the progress towards developing and recommending a governance model and revised organization structure for the delivery of marine transportation services, otherwise known as MTS, which is a key priority set in the mandate letter from the Premier and from members as well. So with the experience gained through 4 seasons of operation, the Department of Infrastructure has identified opportunities for improvement and the need to adapt to a model that will ensure long-term sustainability. We are considering various options for structure and governance with the goal of creating financial stability and improving the operational efficiency of MTS. We will dedicate an executive leader to focus attention on this initiative, to access and recommend the best options, and to implement the transition to a more appropriate operating model. We will also consider to what extent the function of MTS division and the fuel services division might be combined. MTS transports more than half of the volume of petroleum products that are managed by fuel services, and more than half of MTS come from transporting fuel to our communities. We believe that there are opportunities to increase efficiencies and reduce the cost and operational risks. The initiative will be funded through MTS and petroleum product revolving funds, and support will come from existing department resources, so we are not seeking additional funds. Mr. Chair, I will now ask John Vandenberg, Assistant Deputy Minister for Department Infrastructure, to take us through a presentation that gives an overview of MTS, the 4 years of operation, and able to provide more context and to give details on our current operating environment. Mr. Vandenberg will also take us through some of the operational structure and governance options that we've considered, also our next steps. And, if Mr. Chair allows, we will then allow for questions and welcome feedback on the proposed approach from the committee members. Mr. Chair, if we can ask, do you want Mr. Vandenberg to be able to go through the presentation from the beginning, or just simply skim through the front end where we talk a little bit about the history of marine transportation services, and then we will go in detail on the more of the detail on the governance options? I'll leave it to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Mr. Vandenberg, you could proceed with your presentation and then go through the first and second, like as requested by my clerk. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, before we start, we can't see you. I think your video is off. I think it'd be helpful for us to kind of engage in a video conversation where we can actually have a video dialogue. So right now we're just looking at the wall.
Okay. How about that? Can you see us now, Madam Minister?
Absolutely.
Okay, good.
Well, when we start this conversation, start to engage in some of the things we're doing, I really appreciate being able to see some faces, and so that's much better. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Minister,
So-
proceed.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry, Mr. Chair, did you want us to skim through the beginning?
Yeah,
And
the
then
first
we'll-
Sorry, Madam Minister. Yeah, you could skim through the first part of the presentation and then go into detail on the second.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Go ahead, John.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Mr. Chair, Committee. I intended to begin the presentation with an overview of our government's tug and barge initiative. The overview section is section 1 of the presentation, the presentation deck which has been supplied to committee. That is followed by a section that addresses options for the operating structure and governance of GNWT Marine Transportation Services. We could get into some more detail there. So I gather that we have most members have a good understanding of this initiative. So I won't dwell on it. I think I've heard you loud and clear. You don't want to get into too much detail here. So with respect to the sections, you can see on the second slide, if you could turn to the second slide, table of contents. The Northern Transportation Company was founded about 80 years ago, and it's been through a series of permutations. I won't speak to all my notes, but I will say that in 2016, this was a Crown Corporation of the Government of Canada for 36 years, and it became then a private corporation, and then in 2016, in December of 2016, the Government of Northwest Territories assumed these assets through the court matter, and from the receiver for NTCL. We assumed operations in the spring of 2017, operations similar to those that Northern Transportation Company or NTCL did for many years. I'm turning to slide 3 now, and moving along. We have the largest tug and barge fleet in the Canadian Arctic, Canada's only northern shipyard, north of 60th parallel, where the marine assets are maintained. We do core business. Our core business is fuel and deck cargo delivery. We use highly specialized fleet that is built for the Mackenzie River and the coast of the Northwest Territories, the Arctic, and we have terminals at Hay River and Nuvik and Tuktoyaktuk. I'll move along. Our mission, coming up with a mission based on the direction given at the time of asset purchase and the commencement of operations and the formation of MTS, we developed the following mission statement, which was to deliver safe, reliable, and efficient community resupply through the transport of essential fuel products and other goods to communities on Great Slave Lake, Mackenzie River, and the Arctic coast. Attract public and private sector investment in the Northwest Territories economy through establishing reliable marine transportation services and pursuing charter services and shipbuilding and maintenance opportunities, and to foster the development of a NWT resident marine and shipyard workforce with skills and credentials necessary to compromise most of our employees by 2030. Flip over to the next slide, slide 5, the operating environment, Mackenzie River and Arctic Ocean. And without reading all my notes, and again, in the interest of time, MTS does a lot of miles, about 33,000 kilometers annually across the Western Arctic. We do travel into both the Kitikmeot of Nunavut and into the North Slope of Alaska for some charter work. We are affected, MTS is affected often by many, let's say, existential issues, the ice on Great Slave Lake, buoy placement, the Coast Guard, who we support in their navigation, their fixed and floating navigation aid program. We depend on them and they depend on us in order to continue to do operations. So tens of thousands of tons of deck cargo and millions of liters of petroleum products moving by the river and along the coast. I'm flipping to the next slide, and about 1,800 kilometers long, as the slide mentions, the longest river in Canada, and a number of threats on the river, threats, let us say, at least hazards. 4 rapid areas where we have shallows and have to navigate, and we certainly have an experienced team to do this. Many people have been doing this operation, the captains, the mates, for decades, many decades, and of experience moving cargo on the lake and on the river and on the Arctic coast. So I'll flip to the next page. The operating environment. Again, I mentioned this, I'll go fairly quickly on this, but the bold letters there, Arctic waters transit does depend on ice conditions and sea state. We've certainly experienced that over the past couple of years. Conditions can become adverse. It's a tricky business often, and we need experienced marine crews and specialized assets to operate safely in these regions. When you get high water levels, that's a problem. When you get low water levels, that's a problem. But we managed to, for the most part, overcome for the last few years, as our predecessor company did. Assets, I won't go into this too much. We have a fleet of 8 mainline tugs. Again, I mentioned they're custom built for river operations, river and shallow draft coastal operations. They're actually quite unique, and not many people have a fleet like this because not many people are working in an environment like this. We have a unique combination of high horsepower and shallow draft tugboats. And in a typical operating season, 3 to 5 of the boats are operating. We've operated as many as 6. This coming year, the projection is to operate 4 in the lake and on the river in order to do our business. Depending upon charter and demand, we adjust the size of the fleet on an annual basis. To get into a little bit here on the deck cargo barges. Unlike a lot of the world, we operate barges that are both carry petroleum below decks and carry cargo on top of the decks. I think most people are aware of that. We have single hull barges are still used on the Mackenzie River, although they're not used in many places throughout Canada. Right now, I'm going to mention that Transport Canada is urging us and going to likely in the future change the regulations. We have been purchasing and converting single hull barges to double hull in order to operate. We must use double hull barges to operate in the saltwater. In the future, Transport Canada will insist that we use double hull barges to operate on the river as well. So we're working with Transport Canada with respect to their potential, for a reasonable time frame for their potential regulation change. And we have done some extensive papers on what would be required to do with that business in the future, and I'll be pleased to share those papers with the committee. Speak of that later, perhaps. Next slide, which is slide number 10, a photo there of the Hay River Shipyard and the synchro lift. I think I mentioned our most northern shipyard in Canada. A lot of services. The facility allows us to work on not only our vessels, but the Coast Guard vessels indoors in the operational off-season. And obviously that's an asset in a climate like ours, an environment like ours. The facility actually has direct highway access capable of handling, and rail access as well to the terminal at Hay River. I'll flip over to the next page and speak of the terminals. We have 3 terminals, one at Hay River, one at Inuvik, and at Tuktoyaktuk. Quite a bit of land at all of these terminals. There's a picture, an aerial photo of Inuvik terminal, an aerial photo of Tuktoyaktuk, and a photo of the Hay River terminal and the barge loading basin at Hay River. Most of the deck cargo presently originates in Hay River, and we certainly we have terminal facilities at Inuvik and Tuktoyaktuk, which we'll be looking at perhaps improvements in the future if operations increase in the Beaufort Delta region. I'm going to flip to the next page here, slide number 12. I hope I'm not going too fast, but I'm trying to do so because I believe that this is committee's wish. Thank you. I think I saw a thumb up there. So, market, a little talk about market. The core business is certainly fuel and deck cargo delivery. You can see by the fuel volumes there, we have a variety of customers. All of that is revenue business. We have our key customers, and of course, and our most important customers are our communities. I will say that not only do we support the communities through the GNWT Fuel Services Division, the Petroleum Products Program that we've done for many years. But although you might see some commercial customers there, those commercial customers are in turn serving our communities as well, such as at Inuvik, Klavik, and at Tuktoyaktuk, whereas we do provide the fuel to lift the fuel for the commercial customers, the fuel ultimately ends up serving the communities. So quite a bit of the volume is fuel. To the next slide, market deck freight. Community and project cargo is transported on the decks of the fuel barges. As I mentioned, there's deck cargo that probably can't move any other way. Stuff like large modular equipment, houses, heavy equipment would be very difficult to move without a marine service, especially obviously to those communities that have no road or rail access. Deck cargo has risen over the past few years, in our time of operation of this activity, from 12% of revenues to 18% of revenues over the last few years. Market, charters, shipyard, and rentals. We still, the charts basically, without getting into too much details, show that much of the business is actually still our own business and fuel business. So we will contract out marine assets from time to time, or voyage charters or project support work when commercial opportunities present themselves for a positive revenue return. And we do all this in order to offset the cost of doing business. And as I think the folks are aware, it's a highly regulated and costly business. I'm going to flip to the next slide, which is slide 15 for the committee. Employment, we do employ at this time 10 indeterminate full-time GNWT staff at Hay River. We have, since inception, every year increased the number of NWT resident hires relative to non-resident hires. In 2020, we brought on 161 workers through a service provider. That is over and above our 10 GNWT employees. Of those folks, 129 were residents, that about 80% NWT residents. I believe the numbers, 82% of the shipyard workers overall are NWT residents. Etc. So just reading the slides, so I won't get into too much detail here. The total payroll is in excess of $10 million. The next page, just to explain employment, and again, I won't read the slide for the committee, but I will say that we work with 4 bargaining units. One is the GNWT bargaining unit, of course, the UNW. Also having jurisdiction in the shipyard are 3 other unions. One, PSAC, the Public Service Alliance of Canada. They govern the work of the shipyard workers and the terminal workers. The others are Seafarers International Union, SIU, which are most of the folks on the vessels, with the exception of the officers, the captains, the mates, who are Canadian Merchant Services Guild. We have to work with all 3 of those unions, and we do so through a crewing contractor. We hire crewing contractors or staffing contractors, and they manage the hiring and vetting of all the qualifications, payroll and benefits, etc., staff movement, risk, and they establish the memorandum with the unions in cooperation with ourselves. And we have recently gone out in 2017. We had to go out quickly with the contractor to put someone in place because we just didn't have the luxury of going to competition. But that fall, we did go out on a competitive process, and the current contractor, or the contractor that we've used for the last 3 years, got that work through a competitive process. We've recently gone out again. That contractor did win the competition as well. We have another RFP out right now. By the way, this year we did split the employment, the contracts for crewing into 2 contracts. One, and before it was for all employees, PSAC, SIU, and CMSG. This year we went out on 2 separate ones, one for the shipyard workers, in the hopes that we'd get perhaps some competition from Northern. That closed, and that's been awarded. The other one is for that's out right now and it's closed and it's being evaluated, is for the folks that are on the vessels, the seafarers, as we say. And we're looking to close that probably and award that by the end of the month. So it's a mandatory requirement of the contract that the provider of marine personnel is recognized by Transport Canada as a licensed seafarer recruitment and placement service, and that's what we've been working with. I will say that I think it's worth mentioning that the hiring of skilled marine personnel, captains, mates, chief engineers, as well, it's challenging. The industry is continually competing for an ever-decreasing pool of talent here in Canada and in the world for mariners. So it continues to be a challenge, and we do need people that can root out talent and deliver that to us. I'll flip over to economic impact, slide 17. During the first 3 operating years, Marine Transportation Services operations contributed an annual average. Again, I don't want to read all this for you, but bore you, but about $17.1 million a year was calculated to the NWTG and GDP, et cetera. $15.3 million to labor income, 140 person years per annum of employment. I've just reached out to the our department has reached out to the Department of Finance, and they are going to revise this economic impact to include 2020. This economic impact is for the year 17, 18, and 19. Now that we've finished the 2020 year, we'll be able to get a grip on what the 4-year average is for the economic input-output impact. Environmental, we certainly, I think I mentioned it before, we certainly inherited quite a bit of scrap and surplus, and we've been working through that for the last 4 years. The previous operator left a lot of presence behind for us, and so again, it's captured there on the slide. We've been working with the ENR and they've been managing the environmental assessments over the years. It's a lot to swallow. I will say that the reports, I believe they've been made available to the committee, and they can be made available again. The detailed reports of the activities. I know that ENR has completed their 1920 field program, and we have yet to receive a final report on that. They have plans for the 21-22 program as well. The cost of the program is declining, and I do have those costs to share with the committee as well if needed. Special initiatives, we have 2 special initiatives, which I suppose one might say they're not really tug and barge core business activities, but they are, I think, good news. One of the special initiatives we have was to create a marine training center in NTCL's old main office in the Hay River. That was actually done in cooperation with Transport Canada. This is we do lease the property to a Nunavut Fisheries Marine Training Consortium, who have many years of experience in providing training, not only for mariners, but for fish plant workers, that sort of thing. They do a lot of that in Nunavut, and Transport Canada invested heavily in this in order to provide simulators and provide curriculum, and they do provide courses free of charge. They are starting up again. They had to shut down this past year. At the end of I believe the beginning of the summer season, they shut down. I've been told by the executive director that they will be beginning operations again in April of this year. So they'll be actively looking for participants. students participated in over 840 certificate courses at Hay River, and the organization has done some satellite work at in Inuvik and Tuktoyaktuk as well. I will also mention, I think it's worth mentioning, that graduates of these courses getting their bridge watch, it's an introduction to marine for many young people into the marine industry. MTC has managed to get a number of people on Coast Guard vessels, on some private sector vessels, in order to get their sea time. And we've also hired a number on our tugs as well, in order to again begin to replenish the marine workforce here in the Northwest Territories, which is needed. The slide on slide 20, if you could just flip to this one, this is a Marine Research and Survey Initiative. The vessel that's pictured is the old Coast Guard Nahidik that the NWT inherited through the court exercise in December of 2016. Through the funding and interests of the Arctic Research Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization, the vessel has been extensively renovated, and we have leased with them on a long-term revenue positive lease for them to use this vessel for work. They have put students from the Marine Training Center on board. The vessel was integral in performing the bathymetry work for the potential Tulsan subsurface transmission line, and they're doing a number of other things. They have plans for the future as well. I'll flip to the next slide. So I'm just going to conclude. Investment in the fleet. The continuous marine service demonstrates our commitment to the Mackenzie River as a corridor for commerce and transportation, to serve our northern isolated Indigenous communities, sustain and improve marine services to benefit the territory, preserve the NWT intermodal link to the continental supply chain, and sustain strategic northern ports to preserve opportunities for future growth and economic development. I'd like to also say that MTS, the activity, it does engage in the commercial arena, but it does not compete with businesses in the Northwest Territories. If there is any competition, it's for those outside of the Northwest Territories. I would say that NGNWT MTS has become, in fact, a significant employer and can provide a catalyst for territorial economic development for other businesses and for trade between communities and between territories.
So just wait.
Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you, Mr. Chair. So that kind of gives us just a quick overview of some of the operational MTS services that the department provides. The next part of our presentation, Mr. Chair and committee, is going into more of the structure and the governance side of the marine transportation services. Mr. Chair, what is your wish? Would you like us to go into questions based on the overview, or would you like us to continue with the structure and governance? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Yeah, we're going to go with, first of all, we'll start with questions on the overview. Thank you, Mr. Vandenberg, for your presentation with the Minister. I'm going to allow my members 2 questions each, and we'll come back to you. I'll put you back on the list once everybody gets around once, and then keep your preamble short and your answer shorter. To the point. Thank you, Madam Minister. So questions starting with Ms. Nalkaby.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just want to say that I think ADM Vandenberg is probably the only person who can speak as quickly as I can, so I thank him for going through that as fast as he did. I'm going to start with the environmental liabilities section that you mentioned. I know that when we took on MTS, there was quite a bit of sites that required environmental site assessments and cleanup, so I do appreciate the offer to share those reports with the committee, and I look forward to going through them and maybe picking your brain a little bit more detailed one-on-one. Could you please let us know where we're at as far as the overall state of the cleanup? Are we at the end of the process? How much longer do we think we're going to be paying for this cleanup and the liability associated with it? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Nalkaby. Madam Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I'm going to hand it over to Mr. Vandenberg.
Thank
Mr. Vandenberg.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will be happy to share that information. Certainly, I will say that the spend is declining. 2 things I'll mention is that, one thing I'll mention is that, again, these are industrial sites. So the amount of cleanup is defined, and they will remain as industrial sites. What I've been told and what I've gleaned from the reports is that the properties perhaps aren't quite as contaminated as some might have it. We originally felt that we might be surprised by the amount of contamination. In fact, we've been rather positively surprised in that there's less contamination than we believed. There is no known contamination migrating off-site as well. So from that perspective, it's a good story. The amount of spend on this will significantly decrease next year for the program that ENR has planned. I don't know if I want to get into too much more detail in terms of specific. I'm sorry?
Where are we at with the timelines in terms of?
All I've been told now by ENR is that we should be able to button this up, I believe, by the end of next year. And I do have a dollar figure for that for next year, which is a significant reduction. It's been declining, as I say, every year for the last 3 years. We should get to the point where all the environmental site assessments have been done, and that's what I know at the moment. So we'll be concluding we'll be doing another report at the end of this season. I believe the ENR is working on that now with their consultant, and we'll be doing a final one next fall. Hopefully, Mr. Chair, does that answer the question?
Thank you, Mr. Vandenberg. Ms. Knockleby?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the answer. I'm glad to hear it's coming that quickly and that, things weren't as bad as they expected. Sort of staying in the vein of the environment, I'm curious to know what the river infilling the harbor infilling in Hay River and how that's affecting MTS. I know we've been declined a couple times now for the dredging funding from the federal government, and I believe it's the department's intention to continue on with applying for that funding to get that money, but I have to imagine that's going to create issues for MTS as that progresses and gets worse over time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Knockleby. Madam Minister, Mr. Vandenberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, the department is looking for funding to be able to dredge the Hay River because, it is important for our marine transportation services. And, we've done tons of letters to the Coast Guard, to the federal government to be able to provide funding so that we can get this work done. We know it's needed. And, as we continue to delay this piece of work, that it becomes harder on our tugs getting in and out of the harbor. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Next question, Mr. Simpson.
Mr. Chair. One of the areas, I guess, that is of concern to me is the contract went out again this year. It went out in Orsi, got it. We had I think one bidder from the NWT, and looking at the score, it was low. And I guess I have a real concern is that when the tender went out, it was just before Christmas, which probably put the NWT bidder at a bit of a disadvantage because of things being shut down over Christmas. And we continue to bleed money out of the Northwest Territories, and I'm not sure what the contract is worth, but it's probably up there in $8, $9, $10 million, and or I guess probably a lot more than that. And I just have a real concern that when I keep hearing that we had a process. We tendered it, and it was fair. And whenever we give contracts out to southern firms, that's all I ever hear. Or we hear it's a bidder was non-compliant. At what point are we going to look at, or MTS going to really seriously look at trying to find a northern firm to at least provide the personnel for the shore, because that seems to be the simplest. And it really, all we're looking for, from what I can see, is somebody to run a personnel agency is really what it is. And I know the bidders in out of Hay River, they ran companies with hundreds of employees before. So I'm really disappointed that we went out again to a southern firm to supply this. I understand that the contract's only for a year, so that's, I guess, good news in a way, in a sense. and that it'll come out again, and I'm hoping there's no option years for it. So at what point are we going to try and work with northern firms and be serious about it to try and get them to take these contracts on? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Madam Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, you know, the department works with the Department of Finance in looking at some of the procurement, the bidding process. And, you know, in terms of, you know, the department's decision to break this up into two separate contracts, I'm hoping that, you know, we'd get bids in that are competitive and not, you know, over and above what we have in terms of budget. We did get 3 bidders, as you know, the member is referring to. And the first 2, I do want to say, and you know, I had concerns coming from the member from Hay River North and South in terms of, you know, this contract and the department's having a look at the contract and awarding it to a firm that was outside. The first 2 bidders were very close in budget, and you know, we did go back to the Department of Finance to be able to have a closer look at it, because I understand where the member's coming from in terms of providing local northern businesses, but in all fairness, it has to be competitive. So I do want to ask Mr. Vandenberg, Mr. Chair, if he can talk a little bit more, not too much in detail, but talk a little bit about the process and how the department has determined this awarding of this contract. Thank you, Mr. Chair. If that's okay, Mr. Vandenberg can speak a little bit more about the process, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Minister. Yeah, Mr. Vandenberg.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Minister. Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, I will say that it is also the department's interest to see that northern businesses partake, and or perhaps you know, we had hoped for a more competitive bid from the north, but nonetheless, we have the opportunity to look at this closely and see how we can improve that in the future. Certainly one of our objectives is not only to work with northern business, but to work with any contractor who is willing to hire northerners. And as I mentioned in my earlier presentation, the contractors for staffing have increased their number of northern resident hires steadily over the past number of years. And I mentioned figures in the range of 80+% in the shipyard. With respect to this contract, we think that there will be an opportunity in the future to look at this again. Certainly, there will be an opportunity for a northern bidder to let's say sharpen their pencil and compete for this and do the business. I want to add finally that any costs that NTS has suffered, let us say, for services. Payroll, employment is our highest cost in this business, really, on an annual basis. And so those prices get transferred directly to the price of fuel and the price of goods that customers must pay. The freight rates reflect the cost components, which include one of the largest ones, which is the cost of labor. So the cost of labor we're looking for is very competitive, because if it's not, then the people of the communities and the government as well, in the receipt of their services, the cost of their fuel, they have to pay for that. So we look for those opportunities for the future. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Vandenberg. Mr. Simpson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to turn to the scrapping work of the barges, the old barges and that. Can you tell me who is picking up that cost? Is that federal dollars coming to assist, or is that coming from revenue profit generated by MTS? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Madam Minister.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, Don has some notes here. If I can just turn it over to him, Mr. Chair, to talk a little more in detail about some of the scrapping and who's picking up the cost on that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Minister. Mr. Vandenberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I noticed that I have the wrong notes, but I'll do as much of this from memory as I can. Thank you, Minister. The answer is short. The agreements that we reached with the contractor to tear up the old scrap barges and get rid of the metal are cost neutral. That is the cost recovery or the whatever monies the scrapping contractor makes from the destruction of the old barges and tugs, many of which have been torn up and trucked away. That pays for their operation. That is, it's not a cost to the government or to Marine Transportation Services. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Vandenberg. Mr. Bonatouche.
Let's see, Mr. Chair. I had some budget issues, but I'll leave it for the next section where we're discussing in detail probably current state of MTS and moving forward. I'm just wondering, like, you guys are just discussing contracts, and you're mentioning that you're contracting out services within MTS. I'm just not clear on that, and I don't know if the public is clear either. I'm really wondering, what exactly are you contracting out? If I could get a sense of that, Masi.
Thank you, Mr. Bonatouche. Madam Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, majority of the contracts that go out are majority for staffing. We have staffing services, and we use their services to be able to hire and employ personnel to be able to operate and maintain some of the tugs and barges, also the cargo and terminals, as well as the shipyards. So we have, it's a complicated system that Marine Transportation has, because we are dealing with unions. We have a memorandum of understanding with each of the three collective bargaining units. Mr. Vandenberg spoke about three of the different unions, and we have to be careful, because these are heavy unionized positions through our contract services. Mr. Chair, I hope that answered members' questions on the complicated systems that we're having to deal with in terms of our employment services and our contracting.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Mr. Bonatouche.
I'm getting a little bit of it. I just don't understand the whole setup. I know we probably need expertise, but why don't we have that expertise in the higher levels of government to help us see a better picture of this whole MTS system? Because I know you're stating 80% NWT employment, and I'm wondering, why is it not 100%? Everything that we do here in the north should be geared towards the people up the north, even operations and whatnot, regardless of who the union that you're dealing with. I'm just not totally bought into this contracting thing, but I eventually will get there as I review it more often, but that's more just a comment, Masi.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Bonatouche. I will allow the Minister to respond. Yeah, thank you. Madam Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, to be honest, a lot of these skills just do not exist in the Northwest Territories. So, we're having to use some of our contract services to be able to reach out, because, this is a highly competitive business where we're searching for captains, we're searching for, certain employees that have a certain skill set, and to be able to come to the north and navigate through our already challenged rivers and coast. And Mr. Chair, I'm going to get Mr. Vandenberg just to speak a little bit more into detail as to the complexity of being able to have not 100% northern workforce, but I still think 80% is good. Yeah, we want to get to 100, but we are doing the best that we can to be able to provide services and employment to northern residents. Mr. Chair, I just want John to speak a little bit more about that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Mr. Vandenberg.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. The Minister is correct. We are working in an environment, in an industrial environment where marine carriers across Canada and around the world are often competing for many of the same people, and it's challenging. When for the seafarers, we need to have when a staffing contractor provides staff to us, they can do so because they're connected in the industry and they have people, they have connections to people who have worked for them regularly. It's a rather closed, let us say, it's a tight-knit community, and they go out of their way to find people for us. It's interesting, last year I spoke to the president of another marine company that said to me for the first time in their history, they had to shut down one of their vessels because they simply couldn't get a chief engineer. These are the type of people that are very much in demand, and we are challenged to get them here, not only in Northwest Territories, but even as much so in Canada as well. So I will also say in conclusion that many marine carriers do use staffing services. Many of those commercial carriers that you see out there are not actually employing their own directly. They're using services such as these Transport Canada designated marine staffing providers to provide the staff to operate their vessels. So in that sense, we are not different from where we can. We will, where we have administrative and senior management staff, we put them. We have GNWT employees, but the other ones, again, the union folks, PSAC, SIU, and merchants, we go through the staffing contractor, and they compete for those staff in that business. In doing so, by the way, I'll also say that they also manage the vetting, the certificate, the verification of qualifications, drug tests, and they manage the logistics of moving people to and fro. It's quite complicated to bring on 161 people in very short order at the beginning of every season, and it's a job in itself. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry, around.
Thank you, Mr. Vandenberg. Ms. Nalkaby.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I could probably talk about MTS for quite a while, but I won't, because I know we have another part to go on to. My quick question now is, when will you be phasing out all of the single-hulled barges? I thought I saw in your presentation that there were 3 left, so just curious to know when we'll finally see them removed from service. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Nalkaby. Madam Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, the department is working with Transport Canada to be able to look at when are we phasing these single-hull barges, whether it be in 5 years and 10 years. The department is working with Transportation Canada, and I'm looking at John to see if he wants to add anything further, Mr. Chair, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Minister. Mr. Vandenberg.
Yes, thank you for the question. We are working with Transport Canada. Certainly, Transport Canada would like to repeal the Mackenzie River Amendment that allows for the transportation of petroleum products in single-hull barges. They'd like to do that sooner than later. However, the department has been impressing upon Transport Canada the challenge in this. Converting our existing fleet of single-hull barges, or even only the few that we would need in order to continue business as it is not inexpensive. It's a highly regulated business. There's a lot of work to do on these barges, and again, the 7 barges that we have are insufficient to do business as it is. We'll need numerous more barges, and we're hoping that we're encouraging Transport Canada to work closely with us to come up with a reasonable time frame in order to do that, to allow us to be able to afford to do that. We've recently put in for funding for the conversion of a couple of more barges through federal funding, and we're hoping for the best for that. So we'll take advantage of opportunities for federal funding as we go forward to try to get to the point where we're no longer moving any petroleum products on the river with single-hull barges. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Vandenberg. Ms. Nalkaby.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear that and fully support the department moving to that. Just a quick comment about you need more barges to do business, etc. I just want to stand up for the business community and say I did hear a lot about competitiveness of MTS with private cargo companies and how potentially that could lead to delays in community shipping. So just wanted to make more of a comment around that I'm definitely keeping my eye on things there. And then I guess my last question is just around, are you providing any discounts or any sort of fee waivers, things like that for small communities along the barging route to help them deal with the impacts of COVID-19. To me, it seems like an easy way we could help support communities by giving them discounted rates on shipping. I'm not sure, I should know if they get discounts now, but I'm thinking that's an area where we could be offering more support, even just to community members to bring in things so that they can improve their employment situations or start up businesses, such. So I'd like to just urge the minister to work with our counterparts at ITI to look into that kind of funding relief, which could then be used to support small community business. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Knockleby. Madam Minister, would you like?
Sure,
Vandenberg?
Mr. Chair?
Minister, sorry.
You on mute?
No. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, before I hand it over to Mr. Vandenberg, I do want to point out that Marine Transportation Services has not raised any of our fees since 2019. You know, and we try our best to be able to work with the communities to be able to provide the much needed supplies up and down the valley to be able to especially our remote communities. Mr. Chair, you know this as well. Our communities in Nunavut rely on this service to be able to get supplies in the community, to be able to last a full year. So we do want to stress that we have not raised fees, although the operational costs continue to rise. We try our best not to be able to place all the costs on the consumer. Mr. Chair, and if I could see if John wants to add anything further to what I've said around working with the communities to be able to get supplies and, you know, not at enormous cost to the people, especially in the communities. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Minister. Mr. Vandenberg.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I can't add too much to what our minister said. Absolutely right. We did not raise rates this last year in respect of the COVID situation. I should also add that the situation did take many of us. It was surprising and costly. And not only did our revenues fall off significantly last year, we are also the costs of actually managing the COVID situation with respect to crew isolation and rotation was as you can imagine, with the marine operation, not insignificant. And so, you know, just to keep in mind that the Marine Transportation Services situation, the revolving fund as it's set up, means that marine transportation should strive at least to be completely, or at least to the greatest extent, self-funding. The fact is that when we don't raise rates and when we suffer extraordinary expenses, it does have an impact on our financial feasibilities, our situation. So I can't add more than that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vandenberg. Next on the list, I have Rocky. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to go back to the contracting for shore personnel. And my understanding, I guess it was an RFP that went out. So I would like to ask, did we actually talk to the NWT business that responded to that RFP? To get any information, or if their cost was too high to work on that? Because, you know, where you guys sit, I would expect that, you know, listening to the priorities of this government, listening to what we have to say all the time, is that we're trying to push and make sure that northern businesses are given preference, you know, wherever we can give it to them. And it seems like we continually, you know, time after time, to always you know, revert back to hiring southern companies. And I know if we can't do it, if your department or your personnel, the bureaucracy doesn't want to do it, then what I would hope is that we would change out some of that bureaucracy, or, you know, or we've got to do something from this side of the house, I guess. So I'm just wondering you know, how much effort does the department actually put into making this happen? Because there seemed to be some confusion with this RFP. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Madam Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, the Department of Infrastructure, in terms of some of the contracting work that's done here in the Northwest Territories, it's not done on a department only. We work with our Department of Finance to be able to ensure procurement shared services, and we need to follow some of the policies and procedures around how we award these contracts here. In terms of some of the detail as to what happened in Hay River around some of the contracting services, I'm going to ask Mr. Chair to talk. As Minister of Infrastructure, I'm not privy to any of the smaller details that come around the contracting. We rely on our procurement services to ensure that our departments follow the policy, to ensure that, you know, when we're awarding contracts, it's done and it's weighted and it's evaluated so that we be able to dot our I's and cross our T's in terms of, you know, being open contracts and follow the right tendering process. But Mr. Chair, if I can ask Mr. Vandenberg to speak a little more in detail about the situation, specifically around Hay River, because I know the members quite concerned about, you know, whether we've done this fairly and why there was not local, the work wasn't given to a local contractor. And, you know, as I spoke earlier in his previous question about, you know, ensuring that when we award contracts, we look not only at the northern contact, but to be able to ensure that the work is done and it's within scope, it's within budget, and it's competitive. And I think that's the key, to be able to have competitive process. Mr. Chair, I'm going to see if John can add anything further as to more, not in detail, but to be able to ensure that going forward, our department ensures that we capture, working with our partners in finance, that we stay competitive and we focus on northern contracting, northern employment, because that's important to me as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Vandenberg.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief. I know I'm not good at that. I'll say that first of all, we did work through the department did work through legal and through procurement shared services extensively to establish the terms and conditions and the evaluation criteria in the RFP that was issued. It was a request for proposal, and the proponents were aware of the evaluation criteria. Once the RFP is released, there are throughout the entire process, there are policies that must be upheld in the process, and procurement shared services of the Department of Finance acts as a fairness overseer during the process. I also must say that various proponents asked a multitude of questions while the RFP was out, and those questions were all answered to the best of course, the department's and the procurement shared services ability. And at the end of the day, we believe that we understand that a fair and transparent procurement policy was a procurement exercise that took place. I do understand that the Department of Finance and the government public service is looking at a procurement review now, and perhaps that procurement review will out of that will come differing policies for the future. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Vandenberg. Mr. Simpson.
Mr. Chair. Just one other question, and it's to do with, I guess, kind of the operations there. The reason the government purchased the assets was to ensure that we have continuous service into the communities. And I noticed that we are veering away from that and going into providing services to the private sector as well. So I'm just wondering, I guess, are we actually ensuring that our number one priority is the communities resupply, and that if we have time or opportunity, then we look after others? Because I know that we have out of Simpson, there's a firm there that supplies probably some of the river communities, and in the ocean going, there's I think Fathom Marine and maybe some others that actually provide services up there. So are we competing in competition? Are we competing against these guys these companies with government money, and if we are we in discussion with them to try and work with them? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Madam Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, you know, to be honest here, when the GWT purchased NTCL in December of 2016, probably didn't know what they were doing, to be honest. And now the GWT is, you know, tasked with this marine transportation services. And, you know, at the time, I feel like it was important that the GWT had to ensure we get fuel into the communities, we get supplies into the communities. And that was a priority. And I just, you know, I look back and the whole idea was for the GWT to have a look at the governance review. Mr. Chair, we haven't gotten to there yet, but I do want to stress that it's a really important piece to be able to look at, you know, where the department's going in terms of what are we doing with this company? You know, are we, you know, is it a good fit for us? Is it, you know, something that we need to separate? There are a bunch of options. Mr. Chair, I've got 3 different documents in front of me that, you know, speaks to where this marine transportation should be going. And, you know, I think the member is speaking specifically about a company, Cooper, which is not a Northwest Territories company. They are located out of Fort Nelson. But we've worked with them. We've worked with them in the past. We continue to work with them. I don't feel like we're taking business away from anyone. And to be honest, who wants to take on marine transportation services? No one's raising their hand in the territories, let alone in Canada. Mr. Chair, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Minister. We're going to go from overview now, guys, members, to governance. We have, and then any other questions we do have, we could always put in a letter form or get Mr. Vandenberg and the Minister back in front of us. We have another 5 weeks here. So moving on to governance. Any questions, Mr. O'Reilly? Okay. Okay, Madam Minister, you could present. Go ahead. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So the next part of our presentation speaks more specifically around the reason why we're coming to Sketty is to talk about, you know, where's marine transportation services going, you know, having a look at our current structure and, you know, the department. And I just want to thank the members for bearing with us through the first section of this presentation. There's a lot to absorb. But it's complex business, and there are many issues to address, also to resolve. This next section which is shorter, and it's only 6 slides, but I mean, there is a lot of information in there. It addressed some of the concerns with the current structure, and also to consider some alternative models for the operation and governance of marine transportation services here in the Northwest Territories. So, Mr. Chair, I'm going to ask Mr. Vandenberg to talk a little bit more of this next section of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Mr. Vandenberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for bearing with me or with us through the first part of the lengthy introductory presentation. You know, we were trying to help the committee understand that this is a very complex, intensive, and highly regulated business, and because of that, we are engaging in a whole gamut of operations, not only simply bringing fuel to our few and necessary and vulnerable communities, but also doing other business in order to offset those costs. Sometimes when we do business with third-party and commercial operators on charter, with the material doesn't end up, and again, in support of our communities. And I can speak to that in more detail later. But the premise here, when in speaking about governance and an operating model that will work for the future, and what we've looked at, the minister referred to a number of papers, and I'll speak to them at the end of this section of the presentation. The premise that we operate under is that it's presumed that we'll continue this enterprise for the foreseeable future until and unless alternatives are found. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be seeking out alternatives, but we have it now and we're trying to make it work. The Marine Transportation Services Division needs an appropriate structure to effectively operate as a business unit and to meet the goals and objectives of the organization. And some sort of dedicated executive leadership is needed to lead restructuring of this business, to consider and plan and execute the implementation of a new governance and operating model. I'm flipping to the next slide, Mr. Chair. Current structure. Right now, MTS is a program division within the Department of Infrastructure. And in the current operational model, the program is to sustain operations through revenue gained from the sale of transportation services. We're called upon, MTS is called upon to generate revenue, to sustain those operations, and private prior year operations established that to provide marine services to our remote communities alone is not sustainable without significant freight rate increases, excuse me. And so in order to try to reduce those freight increases or the impact of government, we seek revenue business in order to provide a positive revenue return in order to offset those costs. We do operate in a competitive, MTS operates in a competitive environment, but the revenues essentially do remain within the entity, and our return to the operation to maintain the assets, again, very highly regulated industry, expensive assets, expensive labor. We are challenged to achieve a positive revenue return, and this does require the development of a long-term business and operating model that reflects service reliability, cost stability, and managed risk. I'll flip to the next slide. I believe it's page 26, revolving fund. So I believe we've talked about the revolving fund in past discussions. The costs of operations are funded by customers rather than through appropriations. The revolving fund was established to support MTS, and it was established and necessary until a final determination of what kind of model we would need for the future. So right now, the revolving fund, I'll add, it's not on the slide, the revolving fund has a $35 million authorized limit. I suppose in some ways it's comparable to the Yellowknife Airport revolving fund. It's intended to allow for better management of business revenues and expenses. And I'll go on to the next slide again. Now, I didn't get into too much detail here. I'll speak to alternatives. A program division of a department is not a typical forum for business endeavors. We are engaging in business endeavors, whether it's for our own communities or for commercial operations, a profit and loss business, as they say. Typically, when governments do engage in revenue business or business-like activities, a business entity, a corporate entity is established. Now, I mentioned we note a number of alternatives here through research conducted by various commission reports, some of which are here on my left that the minister mentioned. Alternatives for the governance and operating structure of MTS were identified. And in the interest of time, I won't get into defining each of these, although I can go back to them. Ministerial department or secretariat, departmental corporation, crown corporation, a partnership model, or ultimately privatization. And again, I'll speak to each of those in turn. The reports, by the way, all similarly favored some sort of corporate structure for a business activity, a profit and loss activity. And I know that in past it was mentioned that INF was considering the pros and cons of a crown corporation. Corporate structure does have its advantages. There is the limitation of liability, for example. It does facilitate business relationships that makes business partnerships feasible. And a corporate structure might be most appropriate if opportunities arose in future to retain ownership and engage an asset operator, or even to sell or dissolve the entity or to engage in partnerships. I'm going to the next slide on page 28. Again, a little bit of redundancy here. I don't want to get into too much detail. It's functioned as one of 8 program divisions over the last 4 years, reporting to a single ADM. The executive involvement is naturally then limited because of this breadth of engagement. So the program director, it's a very complex business, and that person is fully engaged in managing operations on a daily, weekly, hour-by-hour basis. It's complex, and I think that I'll also add, and the minister spoke to this before she handed it over to me, a solid foundation, the formation of the venture hasn't really been fully addressed and accomplished. So we're looking at, we hope to look at a restructuring of the entity. It's necessary, but it really can't be accomplished within the capacity of the director at the operating level. The goal ultimately is to improve cost control and cost reduction, and to grow commercial revenues, and serve our communities better, and to achieve sustainability now and for the future, whether we retain the business or whether we look at divestment. So I'm flipping to the next slide, slide 29. The notion is to have an executive lead the initiative separate from other programs. We discussed including MTS and the Fuel Services Division. The task of the individual would be to recommend with substantiation an appropriate model for the operation and governance of marine transportation services activity, taking into the opinions of members, of cabinet, of the department, and making that representation with substantiation. The individual would then manage the transition to the operational model that's chosen, focus on restructuring improvements, as I mentioned, and drive forward for operational and financial performance and risk management. Mentioned, and it was mentioned earlier, that one of the major components of the business is the movement of petroleum products, which is certainly a major cost factor in the cost of living. So we certainly want to be able to control that. Opportunities to increase efficiencies and reduce costs are certainly, they're there for us to look at for the future. It's essential, by the way, that this person has a good relationship, the department has a good relationship, maintains relationships with senior officials of Transport Canada, of Department of Fisheries and Oceans, Canadian Coast Guard, DND. They certainly are looking to us as the premier marine business in Western Canadian Arctic, by far the largest opportunity and advantage to them to keep this activity going. I'll flip to the last slide. I know I did threaten to keep it rather short here and then get into a discussion. I want to say that the department has put much discussion, much work towards the investigation of an appropriate operating model to aid the investigation. Several consultants' reports were developed. The department certainly is pleased to share those papers with committee. We do believe that these could aid committee in the input and feedback that we could get on this. And ultimately, the department intends to conclude the investigation of operating and governance model options and return to Executive Council to present a recommendation and seek direction to implement a course of action. The proposed timeline to present this final recommendation would be spring of this year. We feel that we can achieve that because we've done quite a bit of work up until now. We feel we have a good head start on that. And so prior to those actions, as the Minister stated during her opening remarks, we would very much welcome feedback and input from committee on this matter, and we will be pleased now to address any questions that you might have. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Vandenberg. Thank you, Madam Minister. First question we have is from Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, this is the first I've heard about the models and alternatives and so on. So is there a more detailed document that we can see? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Madam Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, the department has done lengthy work within looking at the impact of MTS. We've hired a consultant, a private consultant firm in 2020, and it was Anchor, which was determining a proposed organizational structure for MTS. So that was done in July 2020. We also did a federal public sector to do another review. This was done in 2019. And, they also had a look at some of the proposed governance model for MTS and Fuel Service Division. So that was done 2019, 2020. And then just more recently, we've hired the department, prior to my time, of course, hired a firm to be able to look at both the reports and come up with some suggestions based on what the previous reports have said about the Department of Marine Transportation Services. And this report was just done as recent as September 17 in 2020. So, Mr. Chair, we do have some reports here, and I'm willing to share with committee if there is interest to have a look at some of the proposed governance model going forward for the department. If that's fine, I'm quite happy, and I've instructed the department, we need to be transparent. We're going to do a review of the MTS. We need to ensure that we look at some of the research and take that into consideration, because this is it's a big decision, and we want to make sure that we're doing it right. We're accountable to the residents of the territories by looking at this review. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I don't think I've seen any of these reports, so great if the minister would share those with us. Who is the executive then that's been hired to lead this? I have no idea. I've never heard about this before. Can you tell us who that individual is and if they have a work plan? Are they going to be talking to the public? That kind of thing. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Madam Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, we're not there yet. Right now, what we're doing is just coming up, I've met with Executive Council. Now we're coming back to Standing Committee on Economic Development. And now we're trying to get some input. But we feel to be able to go forward, we need someone that's independent, not independent, but someone that can just focus on some of this work. John mentioned, we have an aggressive schedule. We're looking at making, some preliminary discussions by spring. So I mean, I haven't chosen anyone yet. I'd like some feedback to be able to look at some of the reports, get a better understanding of the capacity that we need to be able to move this forward. Perhaps it could be, external. It could be John. It could be someone dedicated specifically to be able to look at the models. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Ms. Knockaby?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to try to go fast here. I'm curious to know when we're going to have input on the decision. You're talking about the Executive Council leading this initiative separate from the department. I just would like some commitment, or I feel like I'm maybe like Mr. O'Reilly today. I'd like to know when we're going to have our chance to have say on it and whether we'll have input at what gets decided. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Knockaby. Madam Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, we don't, we can take as long as we want. There is no timeline. However, I do want to say that, I'm quite happy to get, some of these reports out, give you some time to be able to have a look at it, to provide some input. We ask feedback to be provided, and, we'll try and get this out as soon as possible by March the 5th, if that works for everyone. I know it's, we're coming up to a week break here in the next week, but I think, if members and committee want to have a look at this, provide us some feedback and input, I'd be quite happy to do that. And if you need more time, we'll take more time. I'm just coming up with a tentative schedule right now that want to see this going forward as of spring. If you want it for summer, we can wait till summer. I just feel like we need to be able to get some valuable input to be able to, I'm not trying to rush this, but I think it is important that we do this right and we do this with input. And I think that's important, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Ms. Knockaby?
Thank you for that commitment from the minister. I do think it is one where you could get a lot of valuable feedback from many of the people on this committee. So I also just want to more of a comment urge that this person, whoever they be a northern person and not somebody coming from the south. I understand wanting the expertise, but we really do need to have somebody, I think, that understands the nature of the north and understands the weather, climatic, all of that, how things are changing. So I just want to make more of a comment than anything. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Knockaby. Just for time, I'm just gonna quick response, Madam Minister. Yes?
Sorry, Mr. Chair. You know what? I agree. This is the nature of the business, going up and down the valley, working with our communities, working with our people. So, I mean, I'll look at all different options, but I think that's important to keep in mind as well. And I respect that feedback from member. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Mr. Johnson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I look forward to seeing the reports, and I'm happy to see that there will be a recommendation brought forward this spring. I guess I would ask the Minister to also provide the timelines, when you have those options, the timelines of implementing them. To me, the obvious option is a Crown Corporation, but that's going to require legislation. So you're going to have to work through how long it takes to establish the legislation. It's going to, it's significant restructuring. I don't see us getting a Crown Corporation up and running in a year from now, but perhaps we can if we're ambitious. So I guess my feedback is I think this is obviously set up to be a Crown Corporation, and I would like to see the department look how long they believe they could establish that in providing those options. And there would have to be legislation, which would give committee more than enough time to provide feedback. So those are my response. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Madam Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, you know, we'd be happy to provide timelines. And I do want to point out that we've done preliminary engagement, but I think we need to do further engagement. We need to look at all the different partners, all the different players that, you know, have a voice in this service that the GNWT provides. And that includes our friends at ITI, our friends in Justice, all our friends across the different government departments to be able to gather input, as well as, you know, the committee as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Mr. Johnson?
No, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I guess I would caution about doing too much engagement. I don't think the corporate structure makes sense for what MTS is. I really do believe it needs to be a Crown Corp. And so I would just start getting the work done. I know you departments love to talk to all the other departments and engage and consult, but we're a couple of years out of having MTS. There is significant liability associated with it. There's large questions. So I encourage you to work quickly on this. Just a comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson, but I'll give the Minister time to respond.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, absolutely. And that's why we're giving focused attention for this. And, you know, I respect, you know, some of the comments. That's just, you know, one member's comment about not engaging too much, but I think it's important. It is. If we're going to do this, we have to do it right, and we have to make sure that we have proper engagement. And, you know, I hear the members concerned about, you know, getting this done quickly. Fair enough, we do, but we want to do it right. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Minister. So I have nobody else on my list for speaking, so we're going to shut this part of the meeting down because we have another committee moving in here quickly. So, seeing no other questions from committee, does the Minister have any closing remarks to the committee before we get your long letter of asks? Madam?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I appreciate the committee's time to be able to present this. And, you know, going forward, we will provide some of the reports. And, you know, I ask committee to please do take the time, review the reports, you know, provide us some feedback by, you know, March the 5th. And if you need more time, let us know. But I'm trying to put a timeline to this. You've asked for timelines. I'm putting a timeline. March the 5th. Have a look at the review. Give us feedback. And, you know, in the meantime, I've got a lot of work to do to be able to find someone independent to have a look at the different models and, you know, yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know you're short for time and I don't want to go on and on, but I do appreciate everybody's time today. So, Kurianaimi, Masi.
We thank you for that, Madam Minister, for not going on. No, just in regards, I'd like to thank the Minister and her staff for joining us here today. This concludes the public portion of our meeting. And you will be getting a letter, Madam Minister, this afternoon from our committee in regards to your presentation today. And it's a hard-working staff we have here. This motion to go into camera, Ms. Knockleby, thank you. All those in favor?